Thank you all for joining this discussion on the findings of a study that EFE recently concluded on the impacts of COVID-19 on youth employment opportunities in Jordan and Palestine, with the support of the Western Union Foundation. My name is Ashley Berry, and I'm the Director of Strategy and Learning at EFE Global. I'm joined today by Elizabeth Roscoe, Executive Director of the Western Union Foundation, and my colleagues from Education for Employment. Ghadir Khufash is the CEO of EFE Jordan, Sado Nakashian is the CEO of EFE Palestine, and Sarah Little is the Director of Programs and Business Development at EFE Global. In addition to discussing the impacts of the pandemic, we'll also outline proposed solutions to integrating youth into the labor market during the COVID-19 economic recovery. We'll be taking questions at the end, so we encourage you to enter your questions into the Q&A box during the session. To get started, Elizabeth Roscoe will say a few words about the collaboration between Education for Employment and the Western Union Foundation.
Thank you, Ashley, and thanks for inviting me to make some opening remarks. I plan to be very brief, as I know we're all keen to get into the study findings and have time for Q&A. So really, I just wanted to highlight the really close synergy between the work of the Western Union Foundation and Education for Employment. We're really proud of the partnership we've had for many years together, providing job and entrepreneur skills, wraparound services, job placements, technology boot camps, etc., to young people. And that's really at the heart of our mission. Our mission, like yours, is to create economic opportunity for young people. For us, it's those especially focused on those who've been displaced or adversely affected and impacted by conflict and crisis. That includes refugees, and of course, those who've been most adversely impacted by the economic effects of COVID-19. So I think this study in particular has been very meaningful for Western Union Foundation to engage in. COVID has had profound effects, and it's adversely affected those individuals and families and communities that are most vulnerable. So for us, having the opportunity to better understand the most effective methods to close the gaps, both in technical skills and in soft skills for young people, to increase job placement and on-the-job success, that's critical, right? And it helps the next generation of diverse and inclusive workforces that will not only, succeed in work and create economic prosperity, but will also use their skills and their company resources to support their communities and solve some of the greatest challenges that we have today, particularly through sustainability and ESG works. So when I looked at the findings, I was both encouraged on one hand by the sense of optimism in the report, that potential for businesses to grow and to expand opportunities for youth, particularly in the technology sector. And also encouraged by how clear the findings are in signposting how we can help youth to seize opportunity. I think there's still some clear challenges to address, such as helping young women to have equal opportunity and equal access to training so they can participate equally in the workforce. So overall, I'm really looking forward to today's discussion, to diving deeper into the results of the study. And as I said at the beginning, really grateful to be both part of this study and a partner for the amazing work that Education for Employment does. Thank you, Ashley, and I'll hand back to you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Now we'll turn the floor over to Ghadir and Sado, who will speak a little bit about the high-level impacts of the pandemic in Jordan and Palestine. Ghadir?
Hello, everyone. It has been a good discussion about the report and about what we have done in collaboration with the Western Union. Of course, we thank them very much for this opportunity to be studying and knowing more about the situation in Jordan and Palestine after the COVID-19. So in Jordan, the first confirmed case was on March 2nd, 2020. And so far, almost 1.7 million cases have been confirmed in Jordan. So there has been lots of measures happening by the government. They, of course, applied the complete lockdown for a number of months. Lots of businesses have been affected. And a defense law about not being able to fire anybody from the private sector has been issued. And this has double sword, I think, and everyone now is anxious to see what will happen after this defense law is lifted, because we have been meeting lots of employer partners, and many of them say that after this defense law is lifted, lots of people are going to be leaving their jobs, unfortunately, and some of them are only kept in their positions right now is because of the defense law. So it's, in one way, it is protecting people from losing their jobs today, but it will not protect them for a longer period of time after the defense law is lifted. So there is you know, some concerns over here. The unemployment rate has jumped over 48% among youth in Jordan in 2021, which is a very, very high percentage. And more than 40% of the labor force is estimated to be in the informal sector. This is where people work. But again, this is a danger for these people who do not have any sort of social security benefits or a cushion to help them in circumstances such as the COVID-19 crisis. Within the period of the crisis itself, EFE has developed its own mechanisms to quickly adapt to the crisis and be able to deliver programs that help youth in Jordan sustain their lives while everything else was not working. Two of the nice examples I want to highlight today. One is with the Western Union, we were able to help 35 women who have lost their businesses or were very much affected by the COVID-19. We help them, have them put back on the track with their businesses. We gave them best practices on how to move on, and we're granted an amount of money that will help them kick off their businesses. This was very important for the sustainability of their work and for them to continue with their businesses. The second model is that we created what we call the online freelancing model. We noticed that there is a whole universe, virtual universe with jobs that are offered to youth worldwide. And if we train our youth to be working from home online as online freelancers, then this will help them connect with the virtual jobs in the whole world. It worked really beautifully with several donors such as AFD and the government of Jordan and the World Bank, and it saved lots of people by allowing them to generate income from home as online freelancers. So when everything else was not working, we tried to find ways to give a sustainable sort of income for people, for youth in Jordan, to be able to survive this crisis and hopefully even after. This is in summary how the situation was in Jordan, and we will learn more from my colleagues on the report itself and some very, very interesting statistics that all of us are going to enjoy today.
Thank you so much, Ghadir. Saro?
Thank you, Ashley, and thank you, Western Union, for giving us this opportunity, and for many youth that we have been helping throughout this year in Palestine, giving them refresher courses on how to keep resilient in their businesses, and then with some grants and assistance to them. Actually, the first confirmed case was on March 5th, and unfortunately, it was in a hotel in Bethlehem with a group of tourists that had brought the virus with them, and then it passed on. By now, we have about 650,000 confirmed cases, according to the WHO reports and our local government reports. However, the government was extremely diligent, and they declared a state of emergency. A lockdown came up, and curfews, closures, you know, the universities, schools, non-essential facilities, and there was a lot of movement restrictions, of course, except for the essential people and essential places like pharmacies and so forth. The problem, the lockdown was there for the first time for 14 days. We thought that was going to be it, but of course, everybody knows how long the lockdowns continued and the effects of the lockdown. However, the economic response of the Palestinian Authority was also great. They requested from the Palestinian Monetary Authority to allow banks to give out overdraws. They allowed businesses to delay some of the checks, and this was a very important step for especially for small businesses. There were low interest business loans given out for to maintain liquidity, and again, this was a very excellent step. Above all this, you know, other than the Ministry of Health, with its very limited capabilities, I think they did a great job to minimize the effects of the pandemic on the overall population. Looking back now, I would like to remember one of our important cases that vulnerable people, you know, and mostly vulnerable people in the refugee camps and so forth had a lot of difficulties, but there was a lot of aid also given to them, not only with financial, but also with food distribution and so forth. So the impact was business closures. There was 42% of the youth were unemployed now, when it was only 40% in 2019. There was a drop in the labor force from 44% to 41% in 2020. There was increased care responsibilities on women. Imagine the children studying from home, going online, and if the mothers are not tech savvy, the parents are not tech savvy, 4 or 5 children in one room, and they were studying through through those rooms. So the mothers had to care for this, and the fathers, of course, were assisting, but mostly the pressure was on the mothers. However, we find out that there was a resilience from the Palestinians, from the government, and from the people against this particular, you know, pandemic over the years. I would like to highlight quickly one of our alumni who had started her own business, and she had 8 employees. She had a digital marketing business, and when she had already started 3 years before the pandemic came in. And now she had the responsibility of keeping the 8 employees. She decided that the employees will stay. She did not pay herself. Of course, she did not get any profits. She paid her employees, and she found an opportunity that local supermarket chain had to go from retail selling to online selling. And she went out there and prepared a platform for that particular supermarket chain, and other small supermarkets and other businesses followed. So she took the opportunity of turning the business not only to existing, you know, brick and mortar businesses, but they turned them into online businesses. And I would really, it is highly appreciated as to how she already was a success story and showed a lot of resilience to this particular pandemic situation. Thank you, Ashley. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Saro. So we'll take a moment to discuss the, or more than a moment, but we'll go over the study overview at this point, and then we'll discuss the actual findings, which is very exciting for us. So I wanted to explain that the study utilized a mixed methods approach that included a youth survey, employer survey, and interviews with key stakeholders and subject matter experts. We focused in this study on vulnerable youth, including refugee youth in Jordan, youth in Gaza, and young women. We considered young women to be vulnerable youth for the purposes of this study because of their low labor force participation rates in both Jordan and Palestine. In addition, we focused on vulnerabilities associated with youth living in under-resourced locations, such as areas outside of capital cities. And we also wanted to focus on youth with disabilities as part of this study. Although we do address issues related to youth with disabilities in this study, due to sample size limitations, our ability to make key contributions in this area were unfortunately limited. The youth survey was an anonymous phone-based survey that it was administered to a stratified random sample of a total of 774 graduates of EFE Youth Workforce Development Programs in Jordan and Palestine. These youth workforce development programs ended between the first quarter of 2019 and the first quarter of 2021. The survey was administered by EFE Jordan and EFE Palestine in August and September of 2021. And the strata that we applied in Jordan included refugee youth, Jordanian youth, and respondent gender. And in Palestine, the strata applied included residents in Gaza, residents in the West Bank, and respondent gender. As you can see here, we had a larger proportion of young women in our sample. However, we used statistical significance statistical significance analysis in order to ensure that the differences that we were finding between the different groups in the sample were valid, statistically speaking. We also used design weights in order to allow for the calculation of unbiased estimators. Although the sample is not representative at the national level, its strength is that it was collected from among vulnerable youth, which means that the findings and recommendations generated by this study will be relevant to them. In terms of the employer study, the employer survey, this was administered anonymously to a convenient sample of 222 employers in September 2021. It was distributed by EFE Jordan and EFE Palestine via email to employer associations and EFE employer partners. It was also shared on social media, specifically the pages of EFE Palestine and EFE Jordan. 18% of responses in Jordan were collected via phone in order to boost the number of responses. Among respondents to the survey, they were primarily holding positions related to human resources and management roles, so they had a good amount of knowledge about what was happening at their companies. As you can see on this slide, there was a large proportion of participating companies that were small and medium-sized enterprises, that is, that they had less than 250 employees. And we also had a large share of micro enterprises in Palestine, that is, companies with less than 10 employees. This makeup is roughly representative of the private sector environment in both Jordan and Palestine, so we were pleased about that. Participating companies were from a wide range of sectors as well, so we did have a broad set of perspectives in the sample. Lastly, we also interviewed 31 individuals who were key stakeholders and subject matter experts. We interviewed people who were within Jordan and Palestine, residing there, and also those that were outside of the MENA region. We got a broad set of perspectives, including individuals working in the private sector, civil society, academia, multilateral organizations, think tanks, and consultancies. Now I'll turn it over to Sarah to begin our discussion of the study results.
Thanks, Ashley. Our first finding is that although many of the private sector companies that we surveyed indicated that they were negatively impacted by COVID-19, many were also optimistic about the potential for their businesses to grow during the COVID-19 recovery. The companies generally stated that they were most affected by reduced demand for their products and services, as well as temporary shutdowns during the pandemic. Most of the surveyed firms remained of a similar size during the first year and a half of the pandemic, but some did downsize, about 13% in Jordan and 12% in Palestine, and some also grew 6% in Jordan and 4% in Palestine. Employers were generally very optimistic about the likelihood of revenue growth over the next 2 years for their companies. As you can see here, the great majority of employers in both Jordan and Palestine noted that it was either likely or extremely likely that their companies would grow. However, some were uncertain about future revenue growth, about 15% in Jordan and 8% in Palestine. Employers were also fairly optimistic about staffing developments at their companies over the next 2 years. About 51% in Jordan and 50% in Palestine indicated that they thought they would increase the number of employees over the next 2 years, whereas 29% in Jordan and 31% in Palestine believed that their staff size would remain the same. However, we'll note that the survey only gathered opinions from businesses that survived the first year and a half of the pandemic, so it doesn't account for the lost jobs that won't return at businesses that have closed. We also found that employees in Jordan and Palestine may continue to benefit from increased flexibility associated with the move to telework during the pandemic, but many will also return to the workplace. Although some of the companies that we surveyed offered telework options prior to the pandemic, many companies moved to expand this option or offer it for the first time as a result of COVID-19. Among the surveyed companies that had at least some staff teleworking, 78% in both Jordan and Palestine had a greater share of staff teleworking a year and a half into the pandemic compared to the pre-pandemic period. Our literature review also found that only an estimated 29% of jobs in Jordan and 23% in Palestine are amenable to telework. So there are many employees that might not have had this opportunity during the pandemic period. Among the companies we surveyed, you can see that 41% in Jordan and 61% in Palestine did make teleworking arrangements available for their staff. And we particularly want to highlight the case of Gaza, which had a large proportion of staff with teleworking arrangements available. 81% of these companies made teleworking available. In terms of plans for teleworking following the COVID-19 crisis, many of the employers in both Jordan and Palestine indicated that staff would all return to their normal work site in the office. However, a fairly significant proportion, 20% in Jordan and 32% in Palestine, indicated that some staff would continue to have a flexible teleworking arrangement. So this indicates that there may continue to be some level of flexibility for a number of employees in both Jordan and Palestine.
Our third finding was that COVID-19 exacerbated the youth employment challenge in Jordan and Palestine. But as most of you on this webinar know, it did not create the challenge. The impact of the pandemic is clear when we consider that among surveyed youth, there was no statistically significant increase in employment rates between the start of the pandemic and a year and a half into it, despite the fact that the youth in the sample were entering the workforce development trainings at different points throughout the pandemic. Under normal circumstances, we would expect to see a gradual increase in employment rates over time as youth completed those trainings and entered the labor market. As you can see on the left portion of this slide, a year and a half into the pandemic, 28% of surveyed youth in Jordan and 32% in Palestine were working. Within the context of the pandemic and more generally, EFE is finding that the provision of job placement support through employer-linked trainings tends to result in higher placement rates. The cohort of EFE graduates from which this sample was drawn included youth who had completed different types of EFE trainings, only some of which involved direct job placement support. As you can see on the right portion of this slide, when considering only youth from the entire cohort who completed employer-linked trainings, a significant share secured employment following completion of those trainings. This reached 63% in Jordan and 87% in Palestine, which is much higher than the employment rate recorded among surveyed youth on the left. This suggests to us that job placement support may be particularly important to easing youth's transition into the labor market, particularly during challenging periods such as the pandemic. An analysis of youth contract types also demonstrates the extent to which youth faced challenges both prior to and during the pandemic. As you can see on this slide, among youth who were employed a year and a half into the pandemic, the most common type of contract under which they were working were limited term contracts. There was also a very high percentage of youth who were working informally or without formal contracts, reaching 1 in 4 in Jordan and 1 in 3 in Palestine. I want to point out that although these contract types also include some youth who were working under internships, that was a very small percentage, only constituting 3% in Jordan and 8% in Palestine. So generally speaking, this contract breakdown is representative of the youth working in wage employment. So why is it important that there were so many youth working under limited term contracts and working informally? Well, it's important because we found that unlimited term contracts were actually associated with greater job stability for youth during the pandemic. So we wanted youth to be able to stay in their positions, and then many youth were, of course, not given that opportunity with these types of contracts that they were working under. In addition, we found that youth who left their employment during the pandemic, among them, it was more common for them to cite the temporary nature of their employment than the impacts of COVID-19 as the reason why they were leaving. That was a surprising finding for us. Furthermore, the study results suggest that there hasn't been a shift in the types of contracts that youth are being offered as a result of the pandemic, which means that this situation predated the pandemic situation. Lastly, we also found that, again, this issue of informal employment was really predating the pandemic. And so this is something that we want to pay particular attention to. And I think from a policy perspective, is important to consider as well. The opinions of employed youth regarding the sufficiency of their incomes to cover their basic needs tell a similar story. As you can see on this slide, a very significant share of youth in both Jordan and Palestine, and this is employed youth specifically. They said that their employment was not, or their income was not sufficient to cover their basic needs, 54% in Jordan and 33% in Palestine. We describe basic needs as things like groceries and transportation, so nothing beyond basic needs. You can also see that there's a very significant share in Palestine compared to Jordan that actually said that their income covered their basic needs all the time. We think the difference may have to do with some socioeconomic differences between the youth in the Palestine survey compared to those in the Jordan survey. Youth in Palestine, on average in the sample, had a higher level of education, and so they may have had access to higher paying job opportunities. Furthermore, we found that youth who held the same position during the first year and a half of the pandemic, 19% of them in Jordan and 31% in Palestine experienced decreases in their income following the start of the pandemic. This might lead us to believe that the reason why youth felt that their income was not sufficient was because of the pandemic. However, we found that youth opinions about the sufficiency of their incomes didn't vary based off of whether they held those positions at the beginning of the pandemic and left them, or if they started those positions later on, or if they held them throughout the entire period. So what that tells us is that this challenge probably predated the pandemic. It wasn't just something that started during this period. So when we consider this data and the data of the employment rates as well as contract types, it tells us that the pandemic really exacerbated those existing challenges. Our fourth finding is that youth employment outcomes during the pandemic reflected longstanding inequities. When we look at the gender data regarding employment outcomes, you can see that young men in both Jordan and Palestine had consistently better employment outcomes than their female peers. In Jordan, young women and men started at the same place at the start of the pandemic, but a year and a half into it, young men were twice as likely to be employed as their female peers. In Palestine, young men were between 59% and 82% more likely to be employed than young women at the 2 points in time. Furthermore, young men in both countries, in both locations, had more longevity in their positions. So they were more than twice as likely than young women to have maintained the same employment from the start of the pandemic through a year and a half into it. When we consider economic inactivity, that is, those individuals who are neither working nor looking for work, it becomes very clear what the key drivers of economic inactivity are for young women. In Jordan, you can see that 47% of young women indicated that they had family responsibilities that kept them from working, whereas in Palestine, they noted that they were currently focused on studying and that was the primary reason that it kept them from working. Now turning our attention to Jordanian and refugee youth in Jordan, we can see that Jordanian youth were significantly more likely than their refugee peers to be employed at both the start of the pandemic and a year and a half into it. We also found that they had greater longevity in their positions. Given these data, we can see that there's really a long-standing challenge of refugee youth in becoming integrated in the labor market. Lastly, we also found that refugee youth were 40% more likely than Jordanian youth to have friends or family members who lost employment as a result of COVID-19, and that there was also, among the employers that we surveyed, 60% of those firms had no employees who were refugees, both at the start of the pandemic and a year and a half into it. So these study results suggest that refugee youth in Jordan, they were not only facing challenges relating to the industries in which they were allowed to be working, but also the number of companies in which they had access to these opportunities. Turning to youth in Gaza, we can see that the youth in the West Bank had significantly more favorable employment outcomes than their peers in Gaza, both at the start of the pandemic and a year and a half into it. We also found that youth in the West Bank had greater longevity in their positions, and they had a greater propensity to switch positions as well, which could indicate that they had more access to opportunities. We also found that youth in Gaza were more likely than their peers in the West Bank to be working in less secure forms of employment, both before the pandemic and a year and a half into it. Furthermore, youth in the West Bank were more likely than youth in Gaza, specifically 2 times as likely to feel that their income was sufficient to cover their basic needs all of the time. Key stakeholders and experts that we consulted for this study noted that the May 2021 conflict played a role in further compounding the youth employment challenges above and beyond the impacts of the pandemic. This is specifically for youth in Gaza. So this may be a factor at play in the employment results recorded under this study. Lastly, before we move on to our next finding, we wanted to note something really notable in the data was that we found that existing job shortages among more vulnerable youth, or that more vulnerable youth were facing, appear to have decreased the extent to which youth felt COVID-19 was the main driver of the current job shortage. So you can see on this visual that between Jordan and Palestine, youth in Jordan were significantly more likely to say that the reason why they faced an obstacle to finding employment was because COVID-19 reduced the jobs available. By comparison, youth in Palestine were significantly more likely to say that it was because of a general lack of opportunities in the market. If we consider that the unemployment rate in Palestine prior to the pandemic was 8 points higher than that in Jordan, it's not surprising that they didn't think that COVID-19 was actually the driver of the job shortage. We saw a similar pattern between Jordanian and refugee youth, in which Jordanian youth were more than twice as likely as refugee youth to cite COVID-19 as the reason, and also between youth in the West Bank and Gaza. Youth in the West Bank were more than twice as likely as youth in Gaza to think that COVID-19 was the reason for this shortage. The last thing I'll note about this is how few respondents cited COVID-19 related health concerns as constituting the key barrier to why they hadn't gotten jobs. So this is likely reflective of the economic challenges, rather than the health challenge of this. So we thought that there's economic challenges that they're facing that really got them more focused on the need to get jobs rather than the actual threat of the health crisis, which may have been concerning to them, but it seems like they were more focused on the economic side of things given the situation. Sarah?
Thanks, Ashley. Our next finding is that youth and employer opinions regarding the most important skills that would be needed over the coming 2 years varied significantly. In Jordan, youth who were asked to reflect on the top 3 skills that they believe would be needed in the labor market cited language skills, followed by ICT and digital skills, and then communication as the most important. However, employers tended to prioritize technical job-specific skills first, followed by communication, and then teamwork as being the most important. In Palestine, the youth and employers tended to agree on the top 3 needed skills, but their prioritization of those skills was different. So youth prioritized ICT and digital skills first, followed by communication, and then technical job-specific skills, whereas employers in Palestine again cited technical job-specific skills as being the most important, followed by ICT and digital skills, and then communication. We will note that it's possible that employers were considering ICT skills to be among technical and job-specific skills, so the importance of those skills might be undercounted. And also, we believe it's possible that youth were focusing on aspirational jobs rather than those that currently exist in the labor market. In terms of employer opinions on whether they'd be seeking the same skills in employees over the next 2 years compared to the pre-pandemic period, you can see that the great majority of employers in both Jordan and Palestine indicated that their in-demand skills now were not different than those in the pre-COVID-19 period. The small number of employers in our survey who said that they were seeking new skills made it difficult to discern the changes in the skill demand with a high level of accuracy. But in general, employers in Jordan who said they'd be seeking employees with different skills now highlighted the need for increased ICT and digital skills, as well as skills in sales and marketing, communication, and design and product development. Whereas in Palestine, employers who were looking for different skills reported an increase in the need for ICT and digital skills, as well as sales and marketing.
Thank you, Sarah. Our final finding that we'll discuss today on this webinar before we go into recommendations pertains to virtual jobs. I want to say that in the report, there are many more findings than this, but this is a highlight of what their report includes. So before we get into the survey data on virtual jobs, I wanted to take a moment to note that at EFE, we view virtual jobs as one of many possible avenues to integrate youth into the labor market. And we think it's important to be realistic about the challenges associated with pursuing virtual jobs alongside the opportunities that they offer. Virtual jobs can offer flexibility and provide income generating opportunities for youth in countries where there are insufficient numbers of job opportunities. However, they also require that youth have needed soft and technical skills and often English skills, as well as access to technology and digital financial services. They also tend to be informal, which can make them less stable than other employment options. We asked youth as part of this survey, specifically unemployed youth, about their level of interest in virtual jobs. 72% in Jordan indicated that they were interested, and 15% indicated that they were extremely interested. We did find that there was a higher level of interest among young men compared to young women, and also among refugee youth compared to Jordanian youth. Young men in Jordan, 42% said that they were extremely interested compared to 11% of young women. And 36% of refugee youth in Jordan indicated that they were extremely interested, as did 8% of Jordanian youth. So you can see there's a greater intensity of interest there. In Palestine, we found that 53% of youth indicated that they were interested, whereas 27% said they were extremely interested. So there was a higher average intensity of interest in Palestine compared to Jordan. We found, in addition, that there was a higher level of interest among young women in Palestine compared to young men. 31% of young women said they were extremely interested, whereas 11% of young men said that they were extremely interested. I'll also note that when we asked about what the most important services were that youth workforce development organizations could provide to young people in respondent cities, a very significant percentage of respondents in Palestine said that incubator services would be helpful. So we started to generally see a pattern within Palestine and Gaza in particular of this focus on entrepreneurship, digital entrepreneurship specifically, and ways that youth could be focusing more on virtual jobs. So it does seem to be an area of focus among youth themselves. In addition, we asked about youth opinions about the feasibility of virtual jobs, because it's one thing to be interested in them. It's a completely different thing to have the technology you need and everything else, all the skills that we mentioned in order to make them a success. So as you can see here, a very significant share of young people felt that it was very feasible for them, 78% in Jordan and 61% in Palestine. However, there were some youth who felt that it would not be feasible for them. This constituted 3% of youth in Jordan and 14% in Palestine. Among this 14% in Palestine, 94% of them were in Gaza. And not surprisingly, the most commonly mentioned challenge among these youth was that they would have challenges relating to electricity connections. As many of you know, this can be a challenge in Gaza. And so that's something important to consider in terms of the viability of virtual jobs within Gaza. What are the support services that are needed? And Sarah will go more into that in the recommendations. Within Jordan, the most commonly cited challenge was internet connections. And interestingly enough, there was actually no difference in the responses between Jordanian and refugee youth regarding that point. We thought that some youth may be overestimating the feasibility of these positions, given that they are rather challenging. Youth have to be managing themselves on a day-to-day basis. They maybe have to manage multiple projects at the same time. So it's possible that in theory, there's a greater percentage of youth who are thinking they're feasible, but they may need more support than they initially realize. Now I'll turn it over to Sarah to go over the selected recommendations from the report.
Thanks, Ashley. Our first recommendation is that youth workforce development programming should provide targeted wraparound services for youth, including job placement support alongside soft and technical skills training in order to improve labor market outcomes for vulnerable youth. As Ashley previously mentioned, the employment rate for youth who received direct job placement support from EFE was much higher than that for the youth survey sample as a whole, which included participants from all of EFE's programs. For this reason, we believe wraparound programs that include direct placement support are more effective than training alone for vulnerable youth. The report also included an assessment of 13 possible sectors for youth employment during the COVID-19 recovery. The results of this research showed that in both Jordan and Palestine, ICT and virtual jobs, vocational jobs, and hospitality and tourism were among the most promising sectors, as well as manufacturing in Jordan and healthcare in Palestine. We'll note regarding the hospitality and tourism sector that this sector was heavily impacted by COVID-19, and therefore the number of jobs created in the sector will be subject to the speed of the economic recovery. But many of the subject matter experts that we consulted felt that these jobs would return and that these sectors would continue to offer significant opportunity for youth moving forward. Our third recommendation is that implementers and funders should focus on building technical and ICT skills of youth and supporting technology hub models to create more sustainable job opportunities related to ICT and virtual freelancing. We recommend technical bootcamp models, even though they're longer and more resource intensive, because we believe it would help with skill differentiation, which would help youth be more competitive in the global marketplace, where they are competing not only against other youth in their communities, but against youth all around the world. We also recommend that implementers and funders consider technology hub models for virtual jobs. This would encourage youth to form freelancing teams rather than working in isolation. And that would provide youth with the opportunity to develop their teamwork and entrepreneurship skills, make virtual freelancing jobs move beyond self-employment alone, and it could help close the gap in youth technology access through hubs that provide stable electricity, internet, and access to IT equipment. Finally, we recommend that implementers and finders focus specifically on developing virtual freelancing capacity among youth in Gaza, given the significant restrictions that exist for other avenues of employment in that region. Our next recommendation is that implementers and funders should focus particular effort on integrating young women into youth workforce development programming in order to address the longstanding challenge of low women's labor force participation and additional challenges hampering women's employment caused by the pandemic. In our research, we noted that young women tended to gravitate towards more traditional fields. For example, in Palestine, women were more likely to expect there to be opportunities for them in education and health services. We believe that implementers should therefore focus on employment programming for women in non-traditional fields, such as mobile maintenance, other ICT-driven fields, as well as vocational work, while remaining attentive to cultural norms and other practical considerations affecting women's job placement and retention. Finally, we recommend that implementers consider placing an increased focus on technical training involving apprenticeship models for young women, especially in Jordan, as young women in Jordan in our survey indicated that technical skills training was the most important service that they would look for in a workforce development organization. Our last recommendation is that implementers consider working directly with private sector employers to develop and roll out onboarding programs that would help close jobs in the technical and soft skills of youth in order to increase their success on the job. Not only would this improve labor market outcomes, but it would also be helpful for employers who are struggling to find the right talent for their workplace.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah. So now we'll open up the floor for questions. Please enter your questions into the Q&A for any of the panelists, and we can get started. It looks like we have a question. So the first question is, what role can the private sector play to assist in implementing these recommendations? Ghadir or Saro, would one or both of you like to take that question?
Okay, thank you, Amr, for your question. As mentioned in the study, private sector are important stakeholders in the whole process. They have to be integrated and engaged. We have to know their needs in the market. We like them to always report on their actual needs, and to also be flexible in terms of hiring youth, hiring women, hiring people with disabilities. At the same time, of course, always abiding by the laws of the country itself, such as the restrictions about hiring refugees, Syrian refugees in Jordan, for example. But I mean, they can always be part of the game. They can always, respond to the requests partners and donors perhaps reach to them about, such as their needs, and then perhaps on-the-job training, the internship programs, accepting more interns into their businesses, sort of the on-the-job training that they can help us with the whole time. Hope I answered your question.
Great, thank you, Ghadir. There's a question about the recording. We can distribute the recording after this session for those of you who are interested. So there's a question also about the sampling procedures followed. So it was a randomized, for the youth survey, it was a randomized sample. So what we did is we worked with the EFE Jordan and EFE Palestine teams to start with a list of everyone who had completed trainings between the first quarter of 2019 and the first quarter of 2021. We had information about the relevant strata. So, in Palestine, were they located in Gaza versus the West Bank? Were they a young man or a young woman? And then they were randomized and selected in that way. With the employer sample, it was a convenient sample, so it was essentially available to employers who were willing to complete it.
Ashley, I would like to add something until we, for the time waiting to hear any questions from the audience. But I would also like to thank UNHCR, who are now with us on the webinar, who have been a great partner with the EFE on reaching out to refugees, Syrian refugees in Jordan, reaching to a wider community from the Syrian refugees so that we help them connect them with the private sector with jobs, whether the traditional jobs or self-employment opportunities or online freelancing. UNHCR have been a great partner, and we like to thank them for that.
Any other questions in the Q&A? We've answered the questions that have come in so far.
I can add up, Ashley, on the question that Amr asked. We have been working on the Skills Development Fund with partnership with the Ministry of Labor. And this, one of the biggest recommendations that came out there was that the private sector should be leading the future of training in Palestine and of course in many other countries, especially in the vocational centers. There should be a lot of cooperation between the private sector so that they know what kind of skills they want for the coming years, for the future. And this is something that we have been advocating now to get the private sector to be really involved in making decisions as to what kind of trainings should be held in these centers.
Great, thank you for that addition, Sado. Well, there aren't any other questions in the Q&A, Ghadir.
I would like to draw people's attention to some statistics regarding the women participation in the labor market in Jordan. It's 14%. The women participation in the labor market in Jordan is 14%. It's very, very low. And as everybody can see from the study that you guys have made, the transition to the virtual sort of life that we're starting to have right now is probably going to enable more women to work, because it has been more convenient for women in Jordan to work virtually than working in the traditional jobs. In the past, virtual was not an option, so women did not have enough opportunities to join the workforce. And I think, just like what you have found in your own results in the report, I agree that I think the COVID-19 and the way we have adapted, everyone has adapted to the virtual sort of jobs and the hybrid models and everything, I think it's going to make it easier for women to enter the workforce working virtually from home. This has also been successful, as I mentioned earlier, with the Syrian refugees, because there have been restrictions on their work and work permits and all of that. But as online freelancers, for example, this has been a very good model that enables them to generate income working as freelancers and working from home. So it's always important to find alternatives and to find ways that make it easier for people to integrate with the workforce, not necessarily the traditional sort of jobs, although we understand joining the social security is definitely a good support system for people, and we have witnessed that during Corona crisis. But then if it's the only option to work as freelancers, then it's the option for their livelihoods, to maintain the minimum that they can live off. And we're talking about lots of rural areas. We're talking about refugee camps and stuff like that. So I mean, the study comes very, it matches how we think about the workforce and how we think things are going to change in the future.
Thank you, Ghadir. So there's a comment about people needing to have the relevant skills to join the job market. Sara or Ghadir, do you have any comments on skill building for people joining the labor market in Jordan and Palestine?
Actually, yes, I just want to add to what Ghadir said. Across the river, we have 80% of women participation of the women eligible in the workforce. So it's like just 4% above that. However, as for skills, we, from most of the studies, as this study also showed, a lot of need there is from there are two kinds of course, skills that are heavily needed. The soft skills have been extremely highlighted with the private sector in Palestine. And we find out that EFE's soft skills program has been a lot of help for youth to get their first job. As we have done this, not only locally and internationally, with engineers that graduate with great technical skills from our local universities, were less competitive in their soft skills compared to Jordan, to Lebanon. And with the soft skills programs that we have developed, they became more competitive, and we could see more and more young engineers being hired into the Gulf countries because of the programs that we have been putting in. So soft skills is definitely an important part of that.
Great.
I would like, I'd like to add, Ashley, in Jordan, there is good demand in the market for vocational jobs right now. So we definitely want to work with the university students and connect them with the jobs and everything, but we also concentrate on the blue collar jobs. There is high demand in the market, but these need some sort of different set of skills. They need the work readiness skills for sure, and then they definitely need some sort of technical or vocational training associated with it, because this is how they become more attractive to be hired by the private sector, when the private sector finds youth who are ready to work in the TVET, the technical and vocational education system in Jordan in particular. And EFE has been doing that with lots of partners, concentrating on skills needed for the TVET sector.
Great, thank you, Ghadir. There's a question about the youth who said that their salaries did not meet their basic needs and whether those individuals are being paid at or below the minimum wage. We didn't ask in the survey what the salaries were that those individuals were being paid. I think it's safe to assume that they were probably being paid around the minimum wage or potentially below, but likely not much higher, because these were youth who were recently entering the labor market. We do think that there is potentially a relationship between youth opinions around the sufficiency of their income and the relationship between the minimum wage and the cost of living in both Jordan and Palestine. There's also a question about the ICT sector, noting that ICT is rather general and that it can include many specific fields. Sarah, would you like to provide any commentary around our thought process around the ICT sector within the context of this report?
Sure, absolutely. So yes, we fully acknowledge that it's extremely broad and can include a number of fields. And we spoke with several private sector partners in the ICT sector to gather some information. And they were working in a variety of areas in the ICT sector, some in virtual jobs related to providing online freelancing work. Others were speaking about software, hardware, engineering, and work around that as well. And so we decided to treat this fairly generally because it wasn't within the scope of the research to go in depth into each type of job available in the ICT sector. But we know that this is an area where both Palestine and Jordan are investing a lot of time and attention into growing it. We do know that there'll be some restrictions that both countries, but particularly Palestine, will face in growing the sector due to some of the restrictions on imports and other areas that they face. And so this is something that we are certainly attentive to when recommending this sector, but the amount of focus and investment that both governments have put into it and growing jobs in different areas and different subsectors there is something that we're attentive to in making our recommendation that youth look to it for additional job opportunities. And I will also follow on what I believe Sarah was saying in the report earlier, was that we are recommending boot camp models that provide more intensive technical training in this area because this will allow for skill differentiation in among youth in both Jordan and Palestine in the ICT sector. Any particular programs that provide just very general programming could have a way of flooding the market and not providing youth with advanced enough skills in certain areas to really compete in the global marketplace and work for some of the bigger IT firms. So we are recommending more intensive programming so that youth really have the skills to compete in the marketplace.
Thank you so much, Sarah. There's a question about the future of renewable energy jobs in Jordan and Palestine. Ghadir and Sarah, would you like to add any thoughts on that?
Jordan's renewable energy sector is, I think it's still growing. We expect the demand in the workforce is going to increase in the future, but I mean, this is something to consider. Definitely, this is something many organizations and NGOs and donors and everybody is working, because all the world is now pro renewable energy and the renewable sector. So I mean, this is something we're keeping an eye on. We're anticipating bigger demand in the market about the renewable energy in the future. And there is another, I'll just quickly, because of the time, answer the second question, perhaps about the ICT sector in Jordan and whether Jordan can become a hub for outsourcing services for countries outside. This is a great model that we're advocating for in Jordan. We think Jordan cannot produce enough jobs to cater for the number of job seekers in Jordan today, but the alternative becomes that Jordan becomes an outsourcing hub for ICT companies elsewhere in Europe, in Canada, in the US, and be able to provide this service for countries outside. We definitely have great potential, and this is something we're actually promoting for, and we see great future for this.
Great, thank you, Ghadir. It looks like we're about out of time. Thank you so much to everyone who shared questions in the Q&A. Thank you everyone for attending. We really appreciate it. Have a great rest of your day. And thank you very much to all of our panelists.
Thank you.